Hello and welcome to Nerdarchy, for nerds by nerds. I'm Nerdicus Dave, and today I am joined by Tony. I should have asked how to pronounce your last name before we started. I'm
It's
going to make an attempt here. Visada.
no, it's classic trap you fell into. It's 100% phonetically spelled Vacinda. There are nothing
Uh,
hard in there anyway. It's all a super soft pronunciation, but that is not an uncommon pronunciation of it. Also,
Visanda. How did you say it?
Vacinda.
Vicinda. My tongue does not cooperate with me often, so. And we are known for mispronouncing things on our channel,
It's
and
great.
especially me. The worst part is because I'm much older than the other guys. Like I would learn and figure out how to say things, and they learned it by listening to me. So inevitably, they all learned it wrong.
You just it's that's like be like, hey, you obviously hung out with Dave at some point because that's the only way you would pronounce things now.
Yeah,
If
yeah.
you
And
have
then
them
there's
correct.
all the South Jersey isms as well.
Right. And it's also really funny. Like then you mix in like fantasy languages and sci-fi terms and other stuff like that, and everything gets kind of cranked up to 11 in the pronunciation space a lot of the time.
Yeah. It looks like I doubled up on your Instagram. Like, so Tony is with a company called Plus One XP. I'll fix that link for you in a moment. And we were just talking a little bit. You do a lot of kind of like niche games, OSR inspired games.
Yeah,
Um, you have a YouTube channel, website, all that good stuff, and you're currently have a project on GameFound right now.
yeah.
Uh,
I I I always tell people our friends make fun of me because I have a I am somebody who with no actual formal training in marketing has spent most of my adult life doing marketing for my own companies, for other companies, doing different forms of retail and sales. So I'm a big fan of developing patter. And so if I was on my channel, we would introduce by saying like, Plus One is a weird little brand that multi-classes in tabletop game design, beard, and skincare alchemy, and the Bardic College of Content Creation. Our hope and desire is to help amazing designers find great players who love their games and help great players find amazing designers whose games they can love. And so um, I will end up developing marketing terms, copy, writing crowdfunding pages for a lot of my friends because I absolutely love the language side of figuring out how to communicate an idea to somebody really, really well. And so that ends up with a lot of really weird niche things coming into
yeah.
play also too.
Oh my god, I absolutely hate writing copy. It is like my least favorite thing to do on the planet.
Yeah, I don't know that it's my like it's one of those things where I don't know that I'm like, oh man, I really love writing copy so much as I really love the victory of sales. Like
Yeah.
and I think those two things kind of temper out. But I do like I wrote a ton of poetry and prose as a high schooler and in college, just for fun, and have always been overly obsessed with words and semantics and other stuff like that. And I'm a huge fan of puns and wordplay. And so any chance I get to kind of pull some of that stuff out, I tend to have a lot of fun with it. And so it's become but like I said, it's one of those things that'll lead you to picking up like, creating a game like our original game Beards and Beyond was like, hey, I'm going to create a 2 to 4 page game that's designed to like help people know we're doing beard balms that are inspired by tabletop role playing game stats, which then the game side of things took off, and the beard balm stuff is all still there. But it's because I will take that lead magnet generation and writing that game very seriously. And that was a ton of punning and alliteration, and I wanted words to matter in that game and there to be a sense of why you would name things or pick certain words for certain things. And so that all that made it into that first game. And a lot of those kind of design sensibilities carry through. But writing an RPG is just writing a ton of really good copy and solid mechanics to go with it.
So what is Down We Go about?
Yeah, so Down We Go is a minimalist OSR style game. It's actually out of all of our games, even though they're all OSR inspired, it's the first one that has more of a classic fantasy vibe. But it's a game that I first laid eyes on about 10 months ago when somebody who's now a very good friend of mine, Marcus Linderum, who's a Swedish designer, popped up this one-page image over in the Minimalist RPG group on Facebook. It was like, hey, I've created this kind of one page OSR system. It said Down We Go at top, had this kind of skeleton figure on it, but the entire game was one page with the rules and the character sheet being that same 1A5 page. And I was like, this is smart. This is really clever. Have you played it yet? How does it play? And he was like, I haven't. And I was like, well, come play it on stream. We'll do a public play test. So we played it in the middle of the day, me and a bunch of people from the West Coast OSR scene in Sweden, which is this great group of folks who are all into like OSR design, who live on the western side of the country. Got to play with a bunch of them, sit down, play through it, and it played swift. It played quick. The way that he had kind of deconstructed a lot of things within the old school style and then rebuilt them to connect in, I think, very clean ways while playing on a lot of tropes was very, very satisfying. We were talking about it afterwards, and he was like, yeah, I made these one-page dungeons, and he showed me these dungeons that he had made for it. And the elegant design, like which whenever I say elegance, I always mean like simplicity with clear intent. He had done this really phenomenal job of just taking one single dungeon map and then being able to create 4 different ways that players could encounter that dungeon that had this very flexible feel and created a different flavor every time you went down into it, but it all fit on one page. And I think it's 100% true that the only things you need to create a dungeon diving campaign is one dungeon in one city, but you always have to figure out why that dungeon can be used over and over again. And Marcus had just done such a great job on these first two tools. I was like, make a city and let's talk about just doing like, I'll just pay for a short print run. We'll do like a 12-page zine. And Marcus came back with these like phenomenal procedures for this randomly generated, constantly shifting city that he called Infinitopolis. And I absolutely fell in love with it from that point in time. And I was like, let's get some new art made. Like, let's talk a little bit more about how we can develop this. Let's bring in a couple contributors to do things you don't necessarily want to do, because you've made 3 really great basic tools that are super approachable from a new GM or new player standpoint. It takes minutes to learn, and you could play city crawls or dungeon dives or a ton of things in the city that you've created, and do full campaigns with incredibly low prep on the GM's part. And I said, I really want to explore that space with you. So that's what we've been doing for the last 10 months. And we popped it up on GameFound at ttrpg.link/DWG live. If you go to gamefound.com, it's one of the 2 projects there. It's very obvious that it's the Down We Go one.
Yeah, it's also, there's a link in the description as well to make it easier for folks to find. So how many pages did you blow it up to?
So currently, the current playtest version that we've been sending out to people includes the city rules, the faction rules, and the a rumor table, and then the core rules in a couple of the core dungeons. And so that current playtest packet is at a little over 20 pages. The final project, because I'll let you have a little bit of a scoop on something we have not announced yet. The final pages, we had said 48 to 60 depending on stretch goals. It looks like it's going to be 52 to 64 because a bunch of people asked us for a solo version of the game, and it's very close to being something you could solo if you really wanted to, if that's a style of play somebody wants to engage in, but it's not something Marcus or I are good at designing.
Yeah.
But we had our friend who runs Floating Chair Club is taking a look at the system and is currently developing an oracle and a set of simple procedures that'll add 2 to 4 pages to the game that'll let you run solo. So it'll be between 52 and 64 pages in print, plus some other physical stretch goals that we're unlocking as we go through.
Yeah, I always find the solo play concept very weird to me for RPGs. I mean, because I always think of it as a kind of a social event.
Yeah, I mean I am not like, that's what immediately I was like, I need somebody who loves solo play, who does solo play, who knows how to do that, not Marcus or I like looking at things and figuring out, all right, here's a way you could play it by yourself. Like, wanted somebody who had eyes on it, who was going to bring something unique to it. And that's been a big hallmark of the project. Like, if we can do something well but someone else can do something better, it's every contribution is just 2 or 3 pages. It's nothing huge, and so it's better to pay somebody else and bring in a different voice who's just going to do that thing incredibly well and add their own flair to it, while building on the minimalist ideals that we've kind of instilled in it to be able to do that. So like, the person who came in and did the factions did an absolutely phenomenal job. The person who did the NPC concepts did an absolutely phenomenal job of building that out. And we're looking for that same thing with solo rules. But again, like, yeah, for me, it's a social event. Like, if I'm sitting down to play an RPG, I'm sitting down with friends online or in person to to be able to have that social experience. That's what drives me. It's not just beating a dungeon, it's being with friends. But I recognize for a lot of people, like something different drives them. And if there's people who want to be able to do that, the system is very close to already being able to allow you to do that. So there's zero reason not to make the changes we need to be able to bring that feel in for people who want it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just because I don't see the value in something doesn't mean I can't see that value for others.
Right.
You
Yeah.
know, it's like streaming, right? Like when we first started putting our games online, I'm like, who's gonna watch this? Like I like Ted is my business partner, and he watches all kinds of streams, and I have like zero desire to watch stream games.
Right.
But I recognize that there's people that love them. And also, like a solo game, I would be terrible at the marketing because my marketing being something like the RPG for people with no friends or something jerkish of that nature.
Yeah, I will buy solo RPGs from time to time. Like Alfred Valley just released Lay on Hands, which is a Zine Quest 3 project, and you're playing as this weird healer working your way across some kind of post-apocalyptic landscape, and it changes when you play it. Like you figure out exactly what those things mean and signify. There's some different classes, but it's the physical item that Alfred has made. In addition to the system's great, but the physical item is great. I buy solo or journaling RPGs all the time, but I only buy them physical and I never play them. Like, I love the idea of the physical meditative practice of a solo RPG, of the narrative exploration of a certain space. Like that idea is enthralling to me, but I only ever want to get it in physical form, but I also never want to play it. I just want to read through it and think about what that would be like and then pull it back into my game. Anna Blackwell from Blackwell Writes is another person who all of their games are just physically very gorgeous. They're all solo RPGs. Thousand-Year-Old Vampire captured everybody's imagination over the course of the last year. But again, a very physically beautiful thing. But it's even weirder to me to think about a solo RPG that I would just download on my computer and sit in front of a screen and play, because I'm like, that doesn't even have the value of me going out and sitting somewhere and being able to be away and think and
Yeah.
be meditative. It just feels like work. And so
So you like the intellectual aspect of it and the kind of the theory craft behind it.
yeah, but I don't ever play them. Like I'll pick them up and read through them, and I'll do a lot of the like, okay, I'll just think through this. I'm not going to write anything down. Like, what is my character doing? And I'll do that for 2 or 3 days sometimes, and then I'm like, all right, that was fun. But I have a child who also absolutely loves solo RPGs, and will go and sit and do it because they are the worst kind of real. They're upstairs right now. They're the worst kind of railroady G.
So it's perfect for them. Like
Yeah, no,
it's the
no.
meme where it's like I want to play a D&D game but be all the players and the GM. It's like
Yeah, which I think solo RPGs. I think if you have a railroady GM, that might be like the takeaway from all this. If you have a GM who you feel like always just wants to tell you what your character is doing, start buying them solo RPGs. Maybe they just need a release.
We
from
we
that.
had a joke like with one of our early GMs. It was like the worst thing that could happen to your character was they didn't like your character or they liked your character a lot. You're like looking for the sweet spot in between to fly under the radar.
Right. Like, please don't care about my character at all.
Yeah, yeah.
So
So what does OSR mean to you? Because when I think of OSR, I just kind of think of D&D retro clones for like the Back Me stuff. I am not that informed on it, and really I've not really played many OSR games.
yeah, no, that's a great question. It's actually one of my favorite questions to ask when I have an interview, like somebody on stream who's an OSR person, because it's also like some people will use it as a noun, as if it's this event that happened or this place that we lived, and other people will use it as an adjective to just describe what they do. And I certainly understand the first part of that. Like, I understand that for a lot of people, it was an experience that they went through at a time and a place that does or does not still exist potentially. But for me, it's mostly an adjective. It describes a style of play. I think Ben Milton's Principia Apocrypha is a great place to look for people who want some more fleshed out about the stuff I'm about to say. But I think essentially, like, rules light to the point where the logic of the play you're doing or the setting that you have happening take equal footing to the rules, which is where the term like rulings over rules and following the logic of the game or does the base fall kind of concepts are are oftentimes brought out. So um, when a narrative reality is created in an OSR game and named, that's going to have some equal weight to it, to the actual rules and the core mechanics. And oftentimes the rules or core mechanics either specifically embrace that, or they're so light as to not get in the way when you want to do something. And this is, I think, distinct from like rule of cool stuff, which comes into play and maybe is if you push forward far enough, where rulings over rules sometimes ends up. But I think it more so is, can I cast wall sideways so it makes a floor for us to walk across, right? Well, logically, if I can create a spectral, wall formed out of sheer magical energy, and I can do it in different sizes, dimensions, colors, shapes based on my preference, there's zero reason why I shouldn't just be able to tilt that sideways and make a wall that is actually can function as a floor. Because I would never tell a player they can't run along the wall for a short difference if they were moving fast enough or acrobatic
Yeah.
enough or anything else like that. A wall functions as a floor. And so, sure, absolutely, if you want to do that, it's still going to fall underneath all the same rules as you using that instance of wall does, but it's 100% a valid way to use that spell. Same thing of like, can I blind somebody by casting light in a dark space or right in front of their face? Absolutely. Like some systems will write that in. Other systems will just be like, a bright light appears. Well, we can look at it and say, what does a bright light do in this specific scenario? We don't need hyper granular rules that are going to spell all of that out. The other one would just be like, if I say all of a sudden that there's a vase in a room and you're going to start a fight around it, there should be a percentage chance that that vase on that pedestal at some point might get knocked over as people are fighting. Especially if I've told you that vase is expensive and important to this adventure, there should probably be some sort of consideration. But in most granular games, there's never a thought about does the vase fall over, because unless the player or the rules dictate that you're interacting with the vase is just a static object in the background that has no sense. So it's where narrative and the rules start to enter into an equal footing with each other, where one tells you how you manipulate the other, but the other one gets to do the same thing to the first. And I think for me, that's almost, I started with GURPS as we were transitioning from third to fourth edition, was my entry point into role playing. And that's a lot of how the GM that first ran for me played. He played with a lot of rulings over rules, which, believe it or not, GURPS actually fully embraces. And I used to be able to quote the rules and pages to you on When in Doubt, Roll and Shout, and never let the rules get in the way of a good time in the two core books, but I can't anymore. But those are absolutely two fundamental pieces, and they ran with that a lot of the time.
What do you think? What is the difference between like an OSR game and just a rules light game then?
Um, I think one of the other major things, and maybe I didn't hit on this, and maybe I left it as an assumption. I think OSR games are like trying to grasp early stages of role-playing games in that, right? So there's a lot of lookbacks to Dungeons and Dragons, AD&D, first and second edition, an attempt to kind of regather what was great about that type of play, which I think there's a level of which that's romanticized, right? And a lot of this came out of like as Google Plus was existing and then deconstructing, and there's a lot of different takes on what exactly the OSR is and who owns it and all that other stuff. There's been attempts to rebrand it and a lot of other pieces like that. But at the end of the day, I think we see most OSR games are either fantasy games that are in kind of the same vein as original and advanced Dungeons and Dragons, and then other ones we might see replicate like Gamma World or some other early like sci-fi RPG concepts, but they're almost all going to root back to that same kind of feel. So, Mothership is a very different type of OSR game. It uses a percentile system, but it really has a lot of the same feel and creates a lot of the same direct realities that a game like Gamma World might, and then just kind of crank some other narrative realities up way higher. And so I think there's a lot of it trying to reclaim a lot of that. What was it like for people who experienced it or didn't in the 70s and very early 80s to sit around with a group of friends and almost be theory crafting around what should the rules of Dungeons and Dragons or another role-playing system be, because the rules don't necessarily all exist yet, right? And I think the rules light way that a lot of them are written is distinct from other rules light games in the sense of it's an invitation when a game is an OSR game to tell you, not only do we think you're gonna have to theory craft some of this, we want you to, and we expect you to. Like, we want you as the GM and the players around the table to figure out some of what's missing on your own based on how you play. Whereas other minimalist games or rules light games oftentimes just have a very smaller window of what they're looking at, and so the rules light realities encompasses everything that will come up in a game, but in just a very small package.
Oftentimes, we look at things through the D&D lens on the channel. We're very D&D centric, and you know I'll always say, like, 1E and 2E had a lot less rules than any other edition of the
Right.
game, but the rules that they had were just needlessly complex.
Right.
It was a lot of those rules were just huge exercises in mental masturbation, really. And that's why, like, while 5e does encapsulate some of the really cool things about 1e and 2e as far as rules over rulings, and they've kind of pared back the rules, and you've gotten to some of the customization of third without the craziness. um as I get older, like, that's about as complex as I want to get.
Right.
And I tend to gravitate towards more rules light system nowadays. We kind of been introduced to each other by Brian Colin, uh, because I guess you had him on your show to talk about Vast Grim, and that might be the only, like.
And we're both going to be playing together. I don't know if we're allowed to talk about this, but
Oh, I didn't know we were.
we're both playing together in an upcoming something related to Vast Grim. We won't give you any details.
Yeah.
But like,
already, that's a lot of beard on one stream.
Yeah, it's a lot of beard on one stream. It's gonna be great. Yeah, and then I think you might be also. I'm writing one of the adventures for it. Are you doing one of the adventures for the experience?
Yeah. So one of the adventures.
Brian's great. I love Merkborg. Johan is, again, another great Swedish design game. Like,
yeah,
and it's also that's really been an interesting part, is to actually explore, like, what is it about Swedish designers that is currently causing not only this kind of renaissance within their community, but also all these really interesting old school but general designs that are very elegant, that they're not rules heavy, but they give you everything you need to be able to play based on a very directed set of things, or how to figure it out if they don't. And yeah, Merkborg and Vast Grim are both, I think, excellent examples of some of those pieces. I think core rules for Merkborg, when condensed down, are 1A5 sheet also. Like, you can fit them all on a sheet. Everything else is roll tables or abilities or other things like that you need more text for. Art, yeah, a ton of gorgeous.
So do you like those kind of, like, design sensibilities?
Merkborg pushes it to another, like, level. I don't dislike Merk. I mean, it's sitting right there. Like, I don't dislike Merkborg at all. I have a hard time with negative space that isn't art space, but I'm totally willing to do it when it's art space. I think the layout of Merkborg is beautiful and sometimes hard to navigate. And yes, there are 2 or 3 pages that are at the back of the book that absolutely should be at the front of the book. But I really enjoy the play of it. And I actually think doing adventures for that style of play are very easy to write. Also like Into the Odd, which Chris is about to release a new version of, and some other systems out there where the ability to take things and put them into, like, everything we have in Down We Go. We only release things in dice numbers so that you can always roll. So even if it's not an explicit table, there's always going to be 8 or 10 or 12 or 20 of something, or 6 or 4. Because we always want a GM to be able to just say, I don't really want to have to think about that. I'm just going to roll all the pieces and then figure out the through line after the fact. And it's one of the things I love about Merkborg. It's one of the things I love about things, because I also feel like it lets the GM experience some surprise, and it lets them enter in as a different type of player, as opposed to somebody who has to spend hours and hours and hours agonizing over all these different pieces, unless they like doing that. And if they like doing that, they absolutely still can. And I think that's one of the great pieces for that. But yeah, Merkborg is beyond what I would typically push for in art in any of my books. But I also love that. I love Johan. I also love that it exists, because I think it gives people permission to push that direction and say, what if your beautiful pages in your book, because we basically have splash pages for art. What if some of your beautiful pages were also functional pages?
Yeah.
What if you wanted to illustrate all the different weapons that you have, so you drew a body with all of them, stabbed through it, smashed into it, whatever it is, and then did your details for each one coming off of that. I think that's a really great layout piece to consider. Where does art and your design content meet each other? And there's some things in some of our books where we do stuff similar to that. Repugnant, one of our recent games that's still in production, it has a lot more of that, because my co-designer is also an artist, and so their ability to my ability to say, here's what's going on this page, and their ability to then take that and say, here's how that stuff's all going to look really pretty on that page, as opposed to just layout, is very present. But Merkborg, like I said, I think the best thing it does is give permission to take your time and space to be able to share the details of your world.
Yeah, I know some people don't like it at all, and I'm like of two minds on it. Like, I really enjoy flipping through that book and looking at it, and the same with Vast Grim as well. But also, there's many pages where you must do a double take to figure out where the information is you want.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that's, like I said, that's the, I think a good indexing and table of content system solves 95% of my problems with Merkborg. And so
Yeah, they don't believe in
um
those. I don't believe. I believe.
yeah, which I already
Yeah.
mentioned Mothership. Like Mothership, which they're about to come out with the box set. And I'm super interested to see what Sean and Alan do with it. But one of the things they were known for was it was all very artistic. There was lots of visual pop. But because it was sci-fi, they did like these kind of skill tree and funnels to kind of draw you through the system. So the information design on Mothership is very spread out also too. But anytime something connects to something else, there is literally a line on the character sheet or in the system that takes you to that place, unless you know where to go. So it's very tight, it's very compacted, it's a far more traditional layout piece. But they actually added in, hey, some things are in kind of weird places, or you need to apply certain stats to other certain stats. So what we've
Yeah.
done anytime that's the case is they come out as a line, they merge together, and they shoot over to that place where they need to go, so that you very clearly know these two numbers get added together and go here. This number gets multiplied by this number and ends up here. And that's a very great way to think about some of that. And I think if we don't have people like, even though it came out afterwards, I think if we don't have things like Merkborg coming out, we don't get as many things like Mothership, because people will get trapped down into, well, it's black text on a white page laid out in either two columns, one column, maybe with a couple of sidebars, but that's it. And so things that open us up to new ways of thinking about information design, I'm always excited about, even if I don't like a specific spread within those.
Yeah, I mean, we need things that push the boundary so they can evolve. Like you said, like that's a great example of like someone going putting out this awesome, beautiful design, and someone else going, "Can we do that in a way that's a little more functional
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
and
And
meet in the middle?"
I even think Vast Grim, it's really interesting to see somebody take what Merkborg did, report it out entirely, because it's the most comprehensive revisioning of Merkborg since the release. And then thinking about, okay, what do we do now that we're here? And a lot of the tables are a little bit clearer. Location in the book, we'll see, it hasn't come out yet, but like the actual spreads are a little bit visually more easy to navigate. And I think there's a mix there of like Johan, who is the designer and the graphic designer on Merkborg, knows exactly what he wants to do and what he's looking for, and is willing to push out on that. Everybody else is looking at that and thinking, okay, how do I do something kind of like what
Yeah.
Johan did, and having a different skill set that's a little bit more ordered in that mindset. But again, as an art piece, Merkborg is infinitely valuable to the RPG scene. As a RPG, it's a phenomenal one to play, and it's a great book. It's and even my critiques of it are like, yeah, again, 2 pages in the back I would have put in the front, or more clearly denoted where they were, at the front. But I don't know, like the entry into that book is so strong with lore and with narrative and with some of the other pieces, that putting them up front interrupts that flow. And again, those are all design choices you make based on how you want people to engage with your game. And I also trust that Johan is a better, specifically graphic designer and artist than I am, though very probably RPG designer too, and put those things in the place that made the most sense to him.
So switching gears a little bit, with Down We Go, like what experience are you trying to convey there?
Yeah, the with Down We Go, like I said, and as the developer, my take on this would probably be slightly different than Marcus. Though Marcus did a really phenomenal letter on what their kind of opening intent was that we had up when we were itch funding. It's just like kind of like his heart for why the game, and it really was Marcus's attempt to grapple mentally with the OSR, with this old school mentality, with taking the games that people loved and the style of play that people loved, which was different in Sweden than it was in the US because it wasn't Dungeons and Dragons. It was, I think, like Demons and Deities or something else with a far more metal name than Dungeons and Dragons. They took that and were just kind of rolling it around in their head. And it was kind of their attempt to resolve a lot of what they loved about it with the things they didn't. And they had some design goals right at the start that kind of helped clarify some of that. But for me, the biggest things I love about it and what's we've brought in to it since then, there were a lot of things that I just picked up on in Marcus's design, and that's that um, everything is iterative. So like what a role, which is what we kind of would conceptually is roles are a fusion of class, stat, and skill into kind of an archetype. The four roles in the game are sneaky, mystical, holy, and bloodthirsty. Those roles are pretty iterative in the way that they are understood. The abilities work the amount of levels that you put into that role times a day. Some of them increase in their efficacy as you level them up also too, whether that's damage or the radius for your light spell or any other number of things as well. But they're very easy to look at, deconstruct, and then replicate. If you're like, I want a ranger class and that's not here, what are you going to call it? How is it going to build? How does it connect to kind of traditional role playing concepts? It's pretty easy for somebody who's never done any design before, who's a GM at their table, who has a player who wants to play a different type of character maybe that isn't covered, to say, oh, I can look at these four classes and figure out how to iterate a ranger class based on this, right? Same thing with all the dungeons, the ability to sit down and look at it and say, okay, I can sketch out 5 to 15 rooms and then create this kind of Mad Lib style fill in the blank process for populating them, and then pick descriptive adjectives that help me know what specifically is in this dungeon. And the best part about it is then all I have to do is come up with a few questions to ask my players about what we call the lore as loot system, which is taking input from your players to populate what's in the dungeon. And so the biggest things that really kind of long term we wanted to do was, again, it was more egalitarian. So we want the GM to come to the table as a player who can also be surprised. GMs don't roll dice, they just manage the narratives and arbitrate kind of what's happening in the world around you, freeing them up a lot more. Players do they defend when things attack, they attack when they want to hit things. They also roll their own luck rolls, and they know if it was good or bad, right? Which is, some people, if you want to pull that back behind the GM screen, feel free to. But they don't know what the response was, right? And what I do is just flip. Sometimes 6 is good and sometimes 6 is bad. Just flip it up, and they'll never know exactly what they're trying to hit. But it took a lot of those things and it moved them into this very, very iterative mentality where people know what goes, can play Down We Go and then know here's what goes into a dungeon, here's what goes into a class, here's what goes into a faction, which makes it then easy at your home table to brew it. And then the other major thing was, like, as much as we love the narrative process of things, we think lore gets in the way of that. We think having a ton of nailed down things about your system and your setting actually get in the way of what's going to happen, because all of a sudden you have to make a choice of, am I going to do things the way as they're written or am I not? Do players know that? How do they feel about that? And that creates some weird tensions at the table. So by eliminating that and saying, here are all the things that can exist in this setting, and you decide what's important, and the main setting itself actually shifts and changes. So if you come back to this spot in 10 weeks, the reality is the city itself may have changed what's happening here, and there may be a different answer to the question that you were asking. And that creates a sense of canon that is very interesting, but players have really loved messing around with and investigating. And lots of times, like when we played like mega dungeons, they'll go up and come back more regularly than they would because they want to see what's changed back in the city, or they want to urban crawl around a whole lot more because there's this kind of sense of endless exploration. And I think if I was going to boil it all down, the ability to take what's on one sheet of paper and then turn that into an endless amount of play, because things are constantly shifting and constantly changing. You're constantly team building into what that looks like, is the heart of what Down We Go is trying to do with a very, very kind of traditional heavy dark fantasy style, and a kind of delightfully OSR feel to it.
And how high are the fatalities in that game? How fatal is it?
Well, we have a sci-fi version that I play tested the other day, which we were doing a 0 level funnel concept, so incredibly high now. However, at default, I would say that I have killed far more players than Marcus has. And whether that says something about him, me, or the system is a good question. But damage is flat. You take a hit of damage, and characters who have mystical as their highest stat, which is what determines your starting health, um, only start out with 2 hits. So 2 hits and you're down, which has a pretty high lethality rate. I think the majority of our characters who have died have been mages, and it's because players have let their mages get out of position and do dumb stuff in a dungeon, which is great. It's great. One of the other fun things that we realized as characters were dying, um, when your new character pops up, you're able to very precisely, because it's not a random roll system. There's not, the stats are selected by you. Your rolls are selected by you. A lot of times players, as they were coming back in, were like, well, I died because of this last time.
Mm-hmm.
And so now when I come back, I'm going to make sure I have a solution to that with my next character. And, it's a very player skill thing to say, all right, none of us took healing abilities. I should drop a couple levels into holy and grab heal, because everyone's on their last legs. And so if we can make it through this fight, I can heal people as soon as we're done. Right. And so we've watched what a little people would be like, that's metagaming. I'm like, no, that's just like, that's smart play when you're down in a dungeon and trying to beat it. Like, there's nothing that says you can't come back as a cleric because your party needs healing, right after this combat. There's nothing in almost any game that would prevent you from doing that. Ours just has some very specific ways that you can immediately kind of launch into some of that. And it's been really cool to watch people do that when they die. But yeah, I don't think I've seen Marcus kill a character. I have killed before this point 3 out of the probably 10 sessions that I've run over the course of the last 2 months on stream. There's another like half dozen that I've killed, but I would say I'm a big fan of telegraphing danger. I'm a big fan of reminding players you might die if you do this, letting them know the consequences of their choices. And I love when a player is always willing to poke the bear anyways, or
Yeah.
trigger the trap just to find out what happens. And I'm never gonna avoid that. And I'm always willing to have creatures be cunning and smart and come after you, and you have to figure out your way out of it, not me have a solution that's going to fiat you at the end. And so that's not to imply that Marcus does, but for a lot of GMs, that's a lot harder. But the great thing is, making a new character is literally, once you know what you're doing, a 1 to 2 minute process, and most of that is writing down the items they have in their inventory. And so it's really easy to pop a character back in after they've done. It's the hireling who was with you. It's the robot you encountered a little while ago, because there were some we did Undying Sands, and so they had encountered a robot in the desert. And whatever it happens to be, whatever your character coming in is, we can figure out how to introduce them in the scene if they're not already in the scene, and you can just pick up and keep on playing.
I'm a big fan of being able to get in fast. Um, so I find that like older editions of D&D really tested the players, where the more modern you got with D&D, the more it was a test of the characters.
Yeah.
Do you feel like with OSR, like that, like staying true to OSR is still like the test of the player, and not so much the character?
Absolutely. Like, I mean, I think it's fun to try to get down on character level when you're making immediate decisions. But I think that's an interpretive lens through which the player views things. And like OSR, another maxim of OSR would be like player skill over character abilities. The answers are not necessarily on your sheet. And again, that's like when I said the longest thing is usually the items that you have in your thing. That is the longest part of our piece. But a lot of newer players, people who've only played 5th edition or 4th edition or other games, oftentimes massively underestimate how valuable your inventory is, and that what you have in the dungeon might be important. And the more random the items, oftentimes the better, because you might use a knife as a way to bridge an electrical shunt, or you might use wax to try to seal a door, or to kind of stop poison from dripping down on somebody. There's a lot of different ways you might use very small things, and very rarely is that going to be a character level decision. That's going to be a player thinking complexly about what's in front of me and then coming up with a solution. And like I said, another one is for GMs, like, never have one solution. Have zero solutions or have multiple solutions, because zero solutions, what it does is say your players are all smarter. Your players together are all smarter than you. Like, even if you're the smartest one at the table, the four of them are going to be smarter than you and see things you're not going to see. And so when you present them with a challenging situation, they're going to band together and use their abilities in ways that can surprise you. So I don't have to know the answer, but if I do know the answer, I should know two or three of them at least, so that I can navigate players in that direction. Not in a sense of railroading, but in a sense of, here are some things you see that might be helpful for you around the room, right? And so player skill is a huge thing for me in all the games that I've run. I would much rather you be creative. And again, are there limits to that? Yeah, to a certain degree, but I do like people to sit down and have fun. If all of a sudden, like, I narrate a cutscene in another part of the dungeon for whatever reason, you as a player may know what that was, but at that point, I still want you to respond largely as your character would. The growl that you heard in the distance that I actually flashed over and told you what it was and what was happening, respond to the growl, not to the specifics. But at the end of the day, we all know at anytime players are doing that, they are aware of that. There's no perfect way to dissociate that information. And OSR games absolutely lean into the mindset of, you as a player need to learn how to play smart. And again, lethality is high, but it's high when you don't do that, when you don't play smart. So tell me how you're tactically approaching this situation. Be intentional about your marching order. If you want to establish what the normal thing you do is when you come to a door every single time, and you tell me in advance, you'll always do that every single time you come to a door, unless you tell me that you're not. But that also means you'll do it every single time you come to a door. So if that's going to trigger something, then that's it. You as the player have to know when to say, I'm doing something differently, right? Or here's how we want to try to make these two things work together. And again, like, sometimes I, as the GM, will have a clear answer, and like that automatically works. Sometimes I'll say, hey, like, what level of holy do you have? There's no perception rolls in most OSR games, or if they are, they don't function at all the same way that they do in modern games. And so I'm going to describe a lot more of the setting, but then I also want you to ask me questions. Tell me small things that you're doing to move stuff around, and I'll tell you if that does anything, how that impacts stuff. You're never going to make a roll to see if there's a secret door. You're going to mess around with the stuff that I've described, and maybe I described something as looking a little off to you, and you're going to go fiddle around with that, and we're going to see what happens.
Nice. We've had many a fight over, one person will be like, hey, like, you don't need to roll for that, just role play. And another being like, well, you're invalidating the mechanical choices that that I made with this character. Why bother with investing in those resources?
Right.
If they don't matter.
Right.
So maybe some of those players should be playing OSR games instead, and not trying to fit that kind of mindset in more of the modern role playing games.
I mean, for me, it's both and, right? So like, if a player, because not all players have learned how to think that way yet, and I do think it's unfair, especially for new players, to be like, you can never make a roll to find that out. I think when you roll, though, you are putting things at risk, especially in an OSR game. Like, rolling should largely be considered a fail state in some way, shape, or form. Now, it might be a good escape hatch in the moment. Like, you've tried everything and you just can't figure it out. That's fine. Let's go ahead and have you roll and see if it does. But again, that's a lot of times where I'd be like, do you have 2 or 3 in holy? All right, let me give you a very specific like thing that your cleric would know. And then you just tell me how you would know it, right? But I also think, I mean, for me, the more frustrating thing is if you're a player who understands how to do other role play and you should have discovered it, but you just rolled poorly, I, as the GM, would have preferred that you not rolled in that situation. I would have preferred that if you walked in and looked around and based on what I described, asked me 2 or 3 intelligent questions. I just think in a newer mode of play, don't make them roll for the information. Like, because there's no reason to risk them losing, or have them roll 1d6 and see how much of the information they got. But a 1 is a success and a 6 is a success. It's just the margin based on what they did if you want to roll. But I would say it's better to oftentimes look at the newer forms of play, perception not being what can you see, but being how well do you interpret this information. And if a player decides to, without the aid of the additional interpretation, go and do things that would allow things to progress forward, let that happen, because they're not operating based on the information. They're operating based on player intuition. Successes, likewise, I'll say sometimes to players like, look, you can mess around with stuff right now narratively, but also like especially on a stream, like if we're coming up on the last 30 minutes, if you want to make a roll, you can. I'm fine either way, right? Like sometimes it's just an option where it's like a mystical character would probably know this. You can either tell me how you know it, you can mess around with the fiction, or you can make a roll and we'll see how well you do, but that's a risk, right? And so letting them know that those three things are options is actually really helpful for players just to make an informed choice on how they want to move forward in that moment.
I'm a big fan of like the gradient, right? If you're going with roles,
Right.
and also like just giving players information, right?
Right.
And then letting them use that information to do whatever they want with it.
Right.
Uh,
I don't like, I've played characters that have good perception, but like for me, again, if a character has good perception, I think far more often, if we're playing like 5th edition, the question should be, all right, what's your bonus in perception? All right, it's 5. Great. Like you're very good at noticing things. I'm going to give you these 2 extra things. Or like and just using a little bit more about what's on the sheet in a very different way that isn't a role state. Like it's good to reward players for the mechanical build that they chose to do. Now games like Down We Go, again, there's no perception skill. If a player's like, I mean, and I was the one who basically in the playtest was the ones who really kind of developed this. I played holy characters a lot. Great. Do I have a sense this thing is unholy? And Marcus was like, oh, it's really not a perception skill. I was like, yeah, I'm not asking about does it look like an unholy symbol or can I notice it with my eyeballs? I'm asking based on the fact that I have 3 in holy, does this feel evil to me? And Marcus is like, oh yeah, absolutely. Great. Like, because my character based on the build I have has a touch to a deity, and so therefore I should be able to tell if this other thing isn't a deity, like is oppositional to me or whatever. In the same way that a mystical character, because they have more points, might notice something about that. But there's not a role for perception thing. It's, hey, okay, how many points do you have, or you have any training in this? Great, right? Bloodthirsty for tactics, sneaky might be like thieves can't or marks, or more details about the type of trap that you're potentially going to have to be dealing with if it's very obvious that there's a trap up ahead. Might be ways that you would interpret that. And again, it could be based on just giving those types of characters that type of information, or it could be at a certain level you get that, or it could be waiting until they ask and then asking them, yes, but how do you know that, right?
Do you have a preferred genre?
I love modern low level superheroes and I never get to play it. I don't most of the systems that do that are not systems that I particularly enjoy, but it is without a doubt my favorite like genre is street level super.
Yeah.
After that, I enjoy hard sci-fi and low fantasy about the same. So I am very obviously telegraphing that grittiness is my jam. I'm a big fan of the grit. So yeah, but street supers, then hard sci-fi or low fantasy after that.
Are there any OSR games that do supers?
Not that I know of. I mean, I think you could easily hack any of them. Like we've talked about an OSR using Down We Go. Like I said, we have the sci-fi hack, we have a post-apocalyptic hack that we unlocked as part of the campaign. We've talked about a supers hack. I'm a big fan of saying somebody who's a better supers designer should come along and take the system and do that with it, other than us just figuring out what that looks like.
Yeah. You guys got to kidnap Steve Kenson.
Yeah, I would say like GURPS really is one of the reasons that I probably love that in some ways, as well as just my obsession with them when I was younger, but with street level supers. But I love the idea of somebody who feels a lot like me, but just has a few advantages, and seeing how they can capitalize on those advantages in a narrative. Like those are things that are incredibly satisfying for me.
So are
And
we talking like kick ass or slightly above that?
like I think probably slightly the kick ass I think is a great like I think kick-ass is we got really good at martial arts, right? And now we're taking things to the street. This would include more fantastic things. This would
Yeah.
include like, all right, cool. Like you can like, shoot fire out, a foot or two from your body. So if people have jumped on you, you can flare up and knock them all back. Or even, I would think not necessarily Batman, but early like Green Archer type stuff. 100%, not necessarily with the camp, but that vibe or that level of like, you're really good at shooting arrows, and how are you capitalizing on that? I think if somebody can just fly but doesn't have any other abilities, I think that's an incredibly low level superpower, even though it opens up a whole lot of tactical options. A gun is still going to stop you, right? Like super strength, but not insanely super strength.
Yeah. Like early Angel was not that impressive.
Yeah. And so I think a lot of those types of things are the power level that I get to. I do like leveling them up. I like leveling them up to the point where they're almost like, four color supers, and then that becomes very non-entertaining to me. Like I like bigger things, like the boys, the comic book, and then the series that was out on Amazon. I actually really like their interpretation, because the power scaling doesn't lose any of the darkness and grit, and it becomes almost like a couple of these people are so powerful as to make almost all the rest of them seem worthless.
Yeah, yeah,
And
it makes them
so
irrelevant.
yeah, and so that type of scaling also can work for me, but for the most part, like once they get up to the point where they would be, a four color superhero, that's where I start to lose interest, because also the grittiness that you have to enter into that point in time tends to be far more, I think, damaging and dehumanizing, and that's challenging for me also, to kind of get into or dive into. And so yeah, those are, I mean, that's really genre wise where I love to set those in some of those grittier spaces.
Do you prefer running games or do you like to be a player?
I love being a player. I don't ever even feel like I'm a good GM. A lot of people will say that they really enjoy my sessions, and I think they're always lying to me. But I think that's a lot of GMs who are very good also. Um,
Yeah.
but a lot of when I write a game, I'm always my GM section is never just more mechanics. It's always it may have more mechanics in it, but they're always geared on here's a technique that I think is a good GM technique. And I've written a mechanic into this game that allows you to easily know when and how to trigger it. And so, like in Beards, we created something called the motif system, which is Swords Without Master is really where I think, first see this become codified in any form of play as a game. But it's basically saying like, hey, there are all these things that your players are going to come up with as they're doing these things they grow attached to, these inside jokes that they make, the thing that narratively becomes important in your game that you didn't start out caring about, but because of the way it's played, now it matters. Let's just give those things a mechanical bonus, because it does two things. One, it allows us to flexibly name those things, but then it also encourages players who are mechanically minded but don't know how to necessarily lean into role play to start engaging in that process a little bit more. So that's what we created a motif system that gives mechanical bonuses when you trigger certain things that are a character exploring an emotional material or some other object about the world around you, but those players are invited to name those also. In Repugnant, like we left items, the item list that you roll on at the very beginning, even because it's all this trashy, gross stuff. It's not like a list of trashy, gross stuff. It's just like you got something sticky, you got something that stinks, you got something that can be used as a club, you got something sharp, and then the players decide what type of junk it was they actually like pulled out. And so I think what's best about me as a GM is honestly that I'm really good at knowing how to ask players what's exciting for them in the moment, and then capitalize on that in the narrative, right? And be able to bring it around to a satisfying conclusion. So it's far more of an improv skill than it is. If somebody was like, I want you to sit down and write out a long campaign and all these details about it, another, I'd be like, zero real good skill at that. Even when I design adventures, a lot of it's, hey, roll on these tables. One of these things is going to be in play. Here, roll on this table. One of these things is going to be in play. Here's text that kind of spans those two things, and you as the GM figure out what exactly is happening around that. Which some people love and some people don't, and that's okay.
You mentioned earlier having kids that game. Do follow in your footsteps with OSR, or are they more in the modern games?
My youngest is the only one for who role playing took. They started playing when they were 8. We played some Dungeon Roll, which I think was a really good system. They were really great at role playing. They are also very narratively minded. They've really latched on to D&D 5th edition, but I think it's mostly because of a lot of the media that they consume.
Mm-hmm.
Which I mean, like, like which I love also, Adventure Zone, Dimension 20, other stuff like that. Very heavily features Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition. So the parasocial relationships that reinforces makes a lot of people think they like 5th edition when they
Yeah.
actually like those shows, which is fine.
Yeah.
They don't play my games because I'm dad, right? Like, and
Yeah.
that's never going to be fun, but their friends are oftentimes excited about my games, which is the worst as a teenager. And so we'll see. I think that they'll end up in an OSR space long term, probably, but in the short term they're just loving that 5th edition life, and that's fine. Like, they really they're starting to try to hack things or homebrew things, and I'm always a big fan of just telling them, like, here are 2 or 3 other systems that may actually do what you want that are not 5th edition.
Yeah.
You don't have to do that work, but like, it's also, it's whatever. Like, they'll figure it out, and all all DMing is a little bit of design. Once you sit down at the player, you're all doing a little bit of game design in some way, shape, or form, and so I'm excited for that. My older ones have played a number of times, and sometimes have even done some longer campaigns with their friends or with some of my older friends that have come over. They've wanted to hop in on them, and we've done that. Some of them really struggle with not getting what their character wants in a way that negatively impacts their mood for the next 3 or 4 days. And so, but we don't always play for a couple of days after that. So just a lot of the ins and outs of how table mechanics and real life mechanics start to blur can sometimes be a little bit hard when your prefrontal cortex is still developing. And so, but I'm excited that they are open to playing, that they all have played, and that they all like different types of playing. One of the coolest things is my third oldest. I've 3 kids who are great at art, one who is like me, decent at art. But the 3 that are great at art, I will sometimes pay them to do art for some of the games. So Santicide Squad, which is our Honey Heist hack, which is like 1 part Italian Job, 1 part Suicide Squad, 1 part Christmas claymation movie. It's all that art is by my kids on that, and it's gorgeous. We have an alchemy supplement for Troika that we're finishing up development on. The character art in those is by my third oldest. And so I'm always encouraging them to be like, look, I'll pay you for art if you want to do it. It's great because it's always fits in my art budget. It's more money than they would typically get from just doing things around the house. But it's also teaching them a little bit about project deadlines, how to manage a timeline, how to communicate when they need more time or need something else, and when asks may or may not be appropriate, all done within the confines of a parent who loves you and is going to be fine with whatever, right? So I like being able to take my kids who are very artistic and support them, but also be able to do something with them that then they get to see their art in print at some point later on, and that's a very cool thing too.
I'm like 50-50, right? I've got one kid that's in the games casually and one that is not at all.
Yeah.
And that's just the way it's going to be.
Yeah, I think that's fine. Like, I don't know, like we'll pull out board games a lot of the time also, and again, it's a mix of very competitive. Some of them are very into it, some of them don't want, they like the idea of it but don't want to sit down, and then other ones have just a really hard time losing, or if someone is mean to them, which then makes it a little bit harder to sit down the next time. And so
yeah. Oh,
for
Munchkin.
those, some of them are competitive. Also, I think most of them are strategic thinkers like me.
Uh-huh.
And a strategic thinker and a competitive person, the only difference is I don't know how to play to lose unless it's a play to lose game. Um, a competitive person doesn't know how to lose at all. And
Yeah.
it's a very subtle difference. Like I'm always going to go my hardest and do my best, even if I'm teaching somebody the game, but I can lose and it's fine. If for some of my other kids, they just can't lose or it's a problem. And
Yeah.
so, you know,
Things will
that's
be flipped. I get it.
so
There's definitely games my family does not like playing with me.
yeah.
They're like, "You're mean." I'm like, "Well, I'm playing to win."
Right. Well, and there's also it's hard. Like there are a couple games I'm really good at that I really love to play,
Yeah.
and those two things kind of go hand in hand. Like the game, like Revolution by Steve Jackson Games is one of my favorite games. I think it's a phenomenal game. I will. There's a rule in that game. If you once the expanded version came out, it's like if a player uses all of their cubes and has to open up another color, they have probably won the game at that point, and you should just let them win and stop playing. Which is a common state of the game when I play, is that I will use all of my scoring markers and run out and have to open up another color. It's just a game that I know how it thinks, and I know. I mean, it's a blind
A
bluffing
mercy rule.
but yeah, there's a mercy rule, which oftentimes it's in effect not just when I play with my family, but when I play with other people.
Yeah.
And it's like I love that game, but it's also hard because I'm basically saying, hey, can dad beat you for the next
Yeah.
hour? And so like, is it fair for me to ask my kids to play those games? Probably not. But then once they've lost, the ones who want to win always want to play again. And so it's just a very hard back and forth process. Again, a lot more of that's about knowing your own internal triggers and other pieces, and learning how to be more more gentle with your children. It's one of the reasons I like role playing games, is because we're not playing for a win state, right?
No.
Um, and so that's for me a lot more friendly of a thing for us to be able to sit down and do, or play collaborative games that aren't we're not competing against each other. And so, but I also there's games that like I don't like Flux. I think Flux is dumb. If somebody likes Flux, that's great. It's a great game for you. My wife's like, why wouldn't you ever play this? I was like, because it's just so random and there's no way to be strategic about it. And so
that's why you don't like it.
I don't enjoy it. Like I mean, even I'd rather just roll a D6 and be like, who the first person to get a 6 wins the game. Because that's essentially all we're doing. And so there's some games like that I'm not interested in playing with them, but also would probably be good ones to play with them, because there's no way for me to just strategize my way out of it. But all those things.
All those things. So we're just past the hour mark. Final thoughts before we head on out?
No, it's been great to sit down and chat with you. I can't wait till things are a little bit further along in the world. We'll have to get together, come across the bridge, hang out for a day.
Yeah.
And,
I mean, it's cool when
games.
I find people that are local.
Local-ish. But yeah, if anybody wants to check out the project, I'd highly encourage you. Some things we didn't talk about. We have almost a dozen contributors on the project, most of whom did very small pieces, like coming up with our NPC specific procedures, or coming up with hex crawl procedures, or coming up with a point crawl, or other pieces like that. It's a phenomenal team from all across the globe. We have, when we started out with a Swedish designer, an American developer, and an Italian artist, it was basically at that point like, well, hey, how many people can we get who I love, who are international in different countries, to touch in on this? So a lot of Brazilian designers are some of our early stretch goals, Diego and Guillermo. And then we have a couple people from the RPGC community who are contributing also too, as core contributor, Pamu the Dovetailer, BJ from Buko Games, a couple other folks who I love, and then we've got some other people who are coming along in stretch goals. It's an absolutely phenomenal crew, and I 100% know that the project is better, again, from bringing in voices who do things and think about certain parts of gameplay better than Marcus or I do, and then being able to take the minimalist format we constructed and then building the iterative process for what does a faction look like? What does an NPC look like? What does an event look like? What are locations and cities that aren't dungeons? How are they built? And being able to give that process over to people has really shown a lot of the flexibility and hardiness of the system, as well as how easy it is to design in and for. So the team is something I am, as the developer, tremendously proud of. But you can find all that stuff at ttrpg.link/DWG live. Like Dave said, there's a link down below. But we would love if you, even if you can't back right now, we totally understand. If you just share it online with people you think would love it, send it to your GM and be like, buy this game so you can run it for me. Those are all great, great things to do. But if you're also a designer out there, we release the third-party license, not because anybody needs permission to hack somebody else's game, no matter what Wizards of the Coast wants you to think, but because we want to be explicit about the fact that we're excited if people do decide to design something for the game. And if you do it before or after the campaign, we would love to share it with other people. So make sure you tag us online at +1EXP on any social media platform.
Well, thanks for coming on, Tony. I appreciate it. It was great chatting with you. And for everyone else, until next time, stay nerdy.